Welcome back to Podwave Pulse. I'm excited for today's deep dive. We're tackling a topic that's close to home for everyone. Food.
It really is universal, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, we all got to eat.
Right.
So, you sent over some super interesting research about how different diets can really affect our bodies. And
Yeah.
I think this is going to be really eye-opening for our listeners to kind of unpack what it all means for them.
I think so too. And you know what's really fascinating right off the bat? The sources you sent actually highlight a key distinction that I think is really important for understanding all of this. It's the difference between minimally processed foods and ultra-processed
Oh,
foods.
yeah. I saw that come up a lot.
Yeah. And one of the studies you shared, a 2019 paper by Kevin Hall, was particularly striking. They did this really cool study at the NIH Clinical Center, and it wasn't just like asking people, hey, what did you eat today? It was a controlled experiment where they actually meticulously measured how participants' bodies responded to these two different types of diets.
Oh, yeah.
Pretty neat, right?
Yeah, I was really impressed with how they did this study. So for 2 weeks, they had participants eat a minimally processed diet. So you're thinking like salmon, brown rice, those kinds of things.
Real whole foods.
Exactly. And they classified those as group 1 foods. And then for another 2 weeks, the same people switched to an ultra-processed diet.
Hmm.
Like at least 80% of their calories came from what this study called group 4 foods.
Mm-hmm.
And the results were surprising.
They really were. So get this. On the ultra-processed diet, the participants ended up eating on average like 500 more calories each day than they did on the minimally processed diet.
Wow.
And not surprisingly, they gained weight, about 2 pounds over those 2 weeks. But it wasn't just the weight gain. The researchers also noticed they tended to eat faster when they were on the ultra-processed diet, and they had these spikes in their insulin and blood glucose levels after eating.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and it's important because you know insulin, it's basically a key that unlocks your cells to let sugar in from your blood. And blood glucose, well, that's just a measure of how much sugar is in your blood.
Right.
So when these levels shoot up quickly after you eat an ultra-processed meal, it means your body is working harder, like really hustling to process all that extra sugar.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Now, on the flip side, when the participants switched over to the minimally processed diet, they actually lost about 2 pounds.
Interesting.
It's like their bodies kind of reset.
Yeah.
What's more, the researchers saw an increase in the hormones that make you feel full and a decrease in the hormones that make you feel hungry. And you know what the funny thing is? This actually went against what Hall had initially expected.
Oh, really?
So it just goes to show you that our intuitions about diet and what we think is healthy can sometimes be really off base.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think twice about all those assumptions we make about food and how our bodies work.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the big question, right? Why such a difference between these two types of diets? Why would one make you eat more and gain weight while the other seems to help you eat less and even lose a little bit?
Yeah.
The sources you provided actually point to two main factors: energy density and this idea of hyperpalatability.
Okay, break those down for us.
Sure. So energy density, it's basically the amount of calories packed into a certain amount of food. Think of it like this. A handful of almonds has a much higher energy density than a handful of, say, lettuce.
Right, because the almonds have more calories in the same amount of space.
Exactly. And it turns out that ultra-processed foods tend to be much more energy dense. You know, think about things like chips or jerky. They often go through processes like dehydration, where the water is removed to preserve them.
Right, so it concentrates the calories.
Exactly. You're taking out the water weight and leaving behind a much more concentrated source of calories. And then we have hyperpalatability, which is a fascinating concept. This is where the work of Dr. Ashley Gearhart and her colleagues comes in. She's done a lot of research on what makes certain foods so incredibly appealing.
So is this like foods that are just super delicious?
Yeah, but it's more than just being tasty.
Yeah.
Hyperpalatable foods are specifically designed to be irresistible to our taste buds, often by combining things like fat, sugar, and salt in ways that you rarely, if ever, find in nature.
Ah, so it's not just that they taste good, it's that they're engineered to trigger these intense cravings.
Exactly. Now, if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense that we'd be drawn to things that are sweet, salty, or fatty. You know, way back when, those flavors were signals that a food was a good source of energy.
Right, you needed those calories to survive.
Right, and our bodies are still kind of programmed to seek those things out. But ultra-processed foods take those basic cravings and turn them up to 11. They combine fat and sugar, or fat and salt, or salt and carbs, in these crazy combinations that you just don't find in nature.
Like a cheesecake is not something you'd find growing on a tree.
Right. Exactly. And that's kind of the problem. These combinations can override our natural fullness signals,
Yeah.
making it really hard to stop eating, even when we've had enough calories.
That's fascinating. So it's like our bodies are getting tricked by these ultra-processed foods.
In a way, yeah.
Hmm.
Our brains are still wired to respond to those primal signals of sweetness, saltiness, and richness, even if they're coming from something that's not actually good for us.
So where does that leave us? I mean, it sounds like these findings are really challenging some of the traditional ideas we've had about nutrition, right?
They definitely are. For a long time, the focus has been on individual nutrients, like don't eat too much fat or watch your cholesterol.
Right.
But what this research suggests is that maybe it's more important to focus on how much our food is processed rather than just looking at the specific nutrients it contains.
So it's not just about the ingredients themselves, but how they're combined and how the food is made.
Exactly. And it's not to say that nutrients aren't important. They definitely are. But it's more about looking at the whole picture, the whole food.
Yeah.
And this is actually reflected in some of the specific examples from the sources you sent. For instance, there's this idea that butter might actually be a better choice than margarine.
Oh, yeah. I was surprised to see that.
I know, right? It kind of goes against everything we've been told.
Right.
But the thinking is that butter, while it does have saturated fat, is a less processed food than margarine, which is often made with hydrogenated oils and other artificial ingredients.
Hmm.
And then there's the comparison between cane sugar and zero-calorie sweeteners. Again, you'd think the zero-calorie option would be the healthier choice, but the research suggests that it might not be that simple.
Because of the way artificial sweeteners can mess with our gut microbiome.
Exactly. They can disrupt the balance of bacteria in our gut, which can have all sorts of downstream effects on our health, including how our bodies process sugar.
So it's almost like artificial sweeteners might make us more sensitive to sugar in the long run.
That's the idea.
Wow. Okay, and there was also that example of whole eggs versus processed liquid eggs.
Yes. That's a great example of how focusing on individual nutrients can be misleading. So for years, we were told to avoid eggs because of their cholesterol content.
Right, the yolks especially.
But now we're finding out that whole eggs, in moderation of course, can actually be part of a healthy diet.
Mm.
And in some cases, they might even be a better choice than processed liquid eggs, which often have the fat and cholesterol removed, but are loaded with preservatives and emulsifiers to make up for it.
So once again, it's about looking at the whole food rather than just getting hung up on a single nutrient.
Precisely.
And this all ties into the whole issue of the obesity epidemic, which is something we've talked about before on the show.
Hmm.
It's a complex problem, and for a long time, the explanation was pretty simple. Calories in, calories out.
Yeah, the idea was that if you consume more calories than you burn, you gain weight. If you consume less than you burn, you lose weight. Simple, right?
Right.
But, as your sources point out, it's not quite that straightforward. While the energy balance concept is true on a basic level, research shows that our bodies handle different types of calories differently. Like, a calorie from a piece of fruit is not going to be processed in exactly the same way as a calorie from a candy bar.
Even though they might have the same number of calories on the label.
Right.
So are you saying that the eat less, move more message is wrong?
Not necessarily. It's more that it's an oversimplification.
Right.
There's this great point from Dr. Dariush Mozaffarian at Tufts University. He points out that calorie consumption in the U.S. actually slightly decreased in the early 2000s.
Oh, interesting.
But guess what? Obesity rates continued to climb.
Wow.
So clearly there's something else going on besides just the sheer number of calories we're taking in. And a growing body of research suggests that the quality of those calories, which is closely linked to how processed they are, might be a big part of the equation.
So what we eat matters as much as, or maybe even more than, how much we eat.
That's the emerging understanding. And this leads us to another really fascinating area of research, the gut microbiome.
Oh, yeah, the poop squad, as Dr. Justin Sonnenberg calls it.
He does have a way with words, doesn't he?
He does.
But in all seriousness, this research on the trillions of bacteria that live in our gut is really revolutionizing our understanding of health and disease. And it turns out that what we eat has a huge impact on these little guys.
Yeah.
It's like every meal leaves a bacterial signature in our gut.
That's kind of wild to think about. So how do ultra-processed foods affect our gut microbiome?
Well, it seems that they tend to decrease the diversity of our gut bacteria, which is not a good thing. A healthy gut microbiome is like a diverse rainforest with all sorts of different species interacting in a balanced way.
Right.
But when we eat a lot of ultra-processed foods, it's like we're bulldozing that rainforest and replacing it with a monoculture.
Oh, so it's like reducing the variety of bacteria in our gut.
Exactly. And some of the good guys, the beneficial bacteria that help us digest food, fight off infection, and regulate our immune system, they can get crowded out.
Hmm. That doesn't sound good.
It's not. And there's even evidence suggesting that artificial sweeteners, which are often found in ultra-processed foods, might negatively impact how our bodies handle sugar by altering the gut microbiome.
So it's another case of something that seems like it should be healthy, but actually might be doing more harm than good.
Yeah, it's complicated.
It is. And speaking of complicated, the research also suggests that our diet can affect not just our gut microbiome, but also our skin microbiome.
Oh, that's right. And this is an area that's still being explored, but it's becoming increasingly clear that the bacteria that live on our skin play a crucial role in our health.
Yeah.
And just like with our gut, what we eat can affect the balance of these bacteria, potentially contributing to skin problems like acne and eczema.
There was even a study linking ultra-processed foods to psoriasis flares, right?
Yes, and that just reinforces the idea that our diet has a far-reaching impact on our health, affecting not just our internal organs, but also our largest organ, our skin.
Yeah.
And another really interesting concept from your sources was this idea of physiological confusion from ultra-processed foods.
Oh, yeah, that was from Dr. Chris Van Tulleken, right?
Yes, he's a British doctor who did this really interesting experiment where he ate an ultra-processed diet for a month.
Really?
And what he found was that it really messed with his sense of taste. The theory is that these foods, because they're designed to be so hyperpalatable, they kind of overload our taste receptors.
Okay.
So over time, we become less sensitive to subtle flavors, and we need more and more stimulation to get that same sense of satisfaction.
So it's like we're desensitizing our taste buds to real food.
Exactly. And the problem is that our sense of taste evolved to help us gauge the nutritional value of food.
Right, like bitter flavors might signal that a plant is poisonous, while sweetness might indicate that a fruit is ripe and full of nutrients.
Exactly. But ultra-processed foods can hijack those signals. They can taste incredibly sweet or savory or fatty, even if they're not actually providing our bodies with the nutrients we need.
So we end up eating more and more, chasing after that satisfaction that never really comes.
Right. And this idea of taste bud rehab is fascinating. It's like we need to retrain our palates to appreciate the subtle flavors of real whole foods.
Yeah, it's like when you cut back on sugary drinks and then you notice how much sweeter fruit tastes.
Exactly. Okay, now let's circle back to that initial study by Kevin Hall for a moment.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about how it was a really well-controlled study, but it was also criticized for being kind of artificial?
Yeah, it was a very controlled environment, which is great for research, but not necessarily how people eat in their everyday lives.
Right. And there was another interesting observation from that study. They found that in the second week of the ultra-processed diet, the participants' excess calorie intake actually started to go down a bit.
Oh, so they weren't eating as much over their baseline as they were in that first week.
Right.
What do you think that means?
It's hard to say for sure, but it could be that there's some level of adaptation that happens over time.
Yeah.
Or maybe the initial novelty of the ultra-processed foods wore off and they weren't as appealing anymore.
That makes sense.
Now, in contrast to that very controlled study, there was also this huge study from Harvard that was based on survey data from a much larger group of people.
Okay.
And their findings were a bit more nuanced. They looked at different categories of ultra-processed foods and found that, well, not all of them were associated with negative health outcomes.
Really? So it's not as simple as saying all ultra-processed foods are bad.
No, it's not. While they did find that sugary drinks and processed meats were linked to a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, some other ultra-processed food, like certain types of bread and breakfast cereals, some dairy products like flavored yogurts, and even some savory snacks were actually linked to a lower risk.
Wow, that really complicates things.
It does. And as Dr. Walter Willett, one of the lead researchers on that study, pointed out, there's a lot of variation in the ingredients and processing methods used to make ultra-processed foods.
Right.
So some additives might be beneficial, some might be harmful, and many are probably neutral.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Not at all. And this complexity is actually reflected in the latest U.S. dietary guidelines. The committee of experts that was tasked with updating the guidelines decided not to make a blanket recommendation to limit ultra-processed foods.
Oh, interesting. So they're acknowledging that it's more complicated than just saying, avoid all processed foods.
Exactly. However, they did specifically recommend avoiding processed meats.
Okay.
So it seems like there's still some debate among experts about the best way to approach this whole issue of ultra-processed foods.
Yeah, and that brings us to another perspective that came up in the sources you shared.
Mhm.
The eat food, not too much, mostly plants, philosophy championed by folks like Michael Pollan and David Levinovitz.
Ah, yes. They're part of a group of thinkers who believe that we might be overcomplicating things with all this talk about ultra-processed foods.
So what's their take on it?
Basically, they argue that the core problem isn't necessarily the ultra-processing itself, but rather the fact that we have such an abundance of cheap, delicious, and calorie-dense food readily available all the time.
Okay.
They're not saying that ultra-processed foods are good for us,
Right.
but they're questioning whether we need to delve into all this complex research on ultra-processing when the solution, in their view, is much simpler. Eat more whole, unprocessed foods and eat them in moderation.
It's a message that certainly resonates with a lot of people. It's simple, it's straightforward, and it makes intuitive sense.
Yeah, there's something to be said for that. But then we have to consider the role of our food environment, which is something that several of the sources highlighted.
Right. The fact that our food choices don't happen in a vacuum. They're heavily influenced by a whole bunch of factors outside of our individual control.
Exactly. Things like where we live, how much money we make, what kinds of food are available in our schools and workplaces, and of course, the massive influence of the food industry.
Right. And speaking of the food industry, Kevin Hall actually suggested that they might be willing to play a role in creating healthier options. But then you have someone like Philip Skrinnis, who's much more skeptical.
Yeah, Skrinnis is definitely more cautious. He warns against putting too much faith in the food industry to truly change their ways, pointing to things like nutritionism and misleading marketing as examples of how they can make unhealthy products seem healthier than they really are.
So what exactly is nutritionism?
It's basically the idea of focusing on individual nutrients out of context, like adding a bit of fiber to a sugary cereal or vitamins to a sugary drink, and then marketing it as a health food.
So it's kind of like a smokescreen to make us think we're making healthy choices when we're not really.
Yeah, that's the concern. And it all highlights the fact that this is a complex problem with no easy solutions.
It really does.
Mhm.
But the fact that we're having these conversations and that there's so much research being done on this topic is encouraging. It shows that people are starting to pay attention to the link between food and health.
I agree. And, Dr. Mosafarian made a really important point about the need to consider alternative hypotheses when trying to understand the obesity epidemic.
What do you mean by that?
Well, for a long time, the focus was on individual behavior. Like, people are just eating too much and not exercising enough.
Right.
But he's suggesting that we need to look beyond that and consider other factors, including the role of ultra-processed foods and how they might be affecting our biology in ways that go beyond simple calories.
So it's about looking at the bigger picture, the systemic factors that are contributing to this problem.
Precisely. And, one interesting example of this is Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s focus on removing ultra-processed foods from schools. It's a policy change that could have a huge impact on children's health and eating habits. And then there's Kevin Hall's follow-up study, which provides even more nuance to this whole discussion. In this study, he looked at different types of ultra-processed foods, categorizing them based on their calorie density and hyperpalatability.
So not all ultra-processed foods are created equal.
Exactly. And what he found was that the most significant overeating happened with the foods that were both very calorie dense and very appealing to our taste buds.
So it's like a double whammy.
Right. But what's really interesting is that even the ultra-processed foods that were high in calories but not as hyperpalatable still led to people eating significantly more than they did on the minimally processed diet.
Wow.
But here's the really important finding. When people ate ultra-processed foods that were neither very calorie-dense nor very hyperpalatable, they actually consumed about the same number of calories as they did on the minimally processed diet.
So there are ultra-processed foods that don't necessarily make us overeat.
That seems to be the case.
That's really good to know.
It is. And Hall concluded from this study that the calorie density of a food seems to play a really big role in how much we overeat.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily the processing itself, but rather how many calories are packed into a given amount of food.
Makes sense.
And finally, we have the perspective of Marion Nestle, who's kind of a legend in the world of nutrition. She sees this whole concept of ultra-processed foods as a really useful tool for thinking about our food choices.
Yeah, I like how she talks about the evolution of nutrition science, from focusing on nutrient deficiencies to heart disease and now to broader dietary patterns.
Yeah, it's about seeing the bigger picture.
Right.
And Nestle argues that sometimes we get so caught up in focusing on individual nutrients that we lose sight of the importance of whole foods and how they're processed.
Like an apple is going to be healthier than apple juice, even if the apple juice has added vitamin C.
Exactly. And she uses the example of Apple Jacks versus shredded wheat to illustrate this point. Apple Jacks are highly processed with all sorts of added sugars and artificial flavors, while shredded wheat is basically just whole grains that have been minimally processed.
All right.
And she also reminds us that even within categories like yogurt, there can be a huge variation in how much processing goes on, which affects how healthy the final product is.
So it's about being a savvy consumer and really looking at the ingredients list to understand what you're actually eating.
Exactly. And I think that's a great takeaway from all of this. Understanding the nuances of how our food is made and how it affects our bodies empowers us to make more informed choices about what we eat.
Yeah, it's not just about calories or fat grams or even individual nutrients.
It's about looking at the whole picture and making choices that support our overall health and well-being.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
I think the big one is that the connection between food and our bodies is far more complex than we often give it credit for. The degree to which a food is processed, the specific combinations of ingredients it contains, and how those ingredients interact with our biology all play a role in our eating habits, our metabolism, and our overall health.
And while there's still a lot we don't know about this topic, the research is pretty clear that focusing on minimally processed foods is a good place to start.
Absolutely. And while not all ultra-processed foods are created equal, being aware of things like calorie density and hyperpalatability can help us make more informed choices when we do reach for those processed
It's
options.
all about finding that balance.
Right, exactly. It's not about being perfect or following rigid rules.
Right.
It's about understanding the science and using that knowledge to make choices that feel good for our bodies and our minds.
Well said. I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on today. And hopefully this has sparked some curiosity and inspired them to think a little bit more critically about the food they're putting into their bodies.
I hope so too. It's fascinating stuff, and the more we learn about it, the better equipped we are to make choices that support our health and well-being.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into fascinating topics that matter.
See you next time.
Bye, everyone.